So today's message is around power outages or being powerless. And we remember that the first 3 steps in a 12-step program include recognizing that we're powerless and life has become unmanageable. And then not only do you recognize that, but then on the second step, you come to believe that there is a God that can restore you in the midst of this powerlessness. And then you make the decision to turn your life and your will over to God. Sometimes we think those things are for other people, but the truth is that we are all powerless. There are times that life becomes unmanageable, that we need to find a way to believe in a God who can restore our lives, and then we need to turn it all over to God. In 2003, in the Northeast, there were a group of people that figured out what it was really like to be powerless. Take a look at this. How does that make you feel? 55 million people in 2003 were without power, some for days. They were truly powerless. So what happens when people are truly powerless? Well, it seems to me that in the midst of this power outage, people had one choice or another. One choice, which we heard a lot of the stories about, were the people who looted and the people who during the blackout took it as an opportunity to take advantage of the situation and others. But then most people accepted that they were in a situation that they could not manage. And they were powerless. And in the midst of this crisis, with subways being out, with elevators not working, people who were powerless found a way to work together. In the midst of all of this, literally, people made human chains to help people out of elevators and to help people out of the subways. The hotels that ran $200 and $300 a night in the middle of Manhattan just simply opened their doors to people who might need a place to stay. Restaurants, knowing that they could not preserve the food in refrigerators or freezers, just started cooking up food and offering free meals to people. Neighbors came together in the streets and shared in common meals. People in Manhattan opened their homes to fellows who got stuck in Manhattan and couldn't make their way back out to the boroughs. It seems to me as though when given a situation like this, we come to realize how dependent we are on an energy we cannot see. And for the most part, when there is no power, people find the way in the midst of weakness to bring goodness into the world. The Apostle Paul, some 2,000 years before that, understood this concept in a very real way without the electricity we have today. Now, I want to note that Paul was an educated man who had a business. He was an orator. He engaged with all kinds of people. He was politically and religiously connected. He was one of those guys who, when you looked at on the outside, looked like he had it all together. That's why the text we're going to look at today is so interesting, because for Paul, having it all together has nothing to do with education or placement in life. It had nothing to do with wealth, but instead, it had everything to do with his weakness, his powerlessness. Because his weakness and his powerlessness, he believed, and I believe too, gave him an opportunity to experience the grace of God. In fact, Paul wanted people to know that he was nothing, that he was powerless, and that it was only God's grace that gave him what he needed for life. He knew God's grace was sufficient, and God worked through all of Paul's weaknesses. We're going to take a look at 2 Corinthians, the 12th chapter, verses 6 through 10, and this is the Message translation. Paul says, "If I had mind to brag a little, I could do it without looking ridiculous, and I'd still be speaking plain truth all the way, but I'll spare you. I don't want anyone imagining me as anything other than the fool you'd encounter if you saw me on the street or heard me talk. Because of the extravagance of those revelations, and so I wouldn't get a big head, I was given the gift of a handicapped." A lot of us heard this as a thorn in Paul's side growing up. And this thorn was to keep me in constant touch with my limitations. Satan's angels did their best to get me down. What he did, in fact, was push me to my knees. No danger then of walking around high and mighty. At first, I didn't think of it as a gift, and I begged God to remove it. 3 times I did that. And then he told me, "My grace is enough. It's all you need. My strength comes into its own being in your weakness." Once I heard that, I was glad to let it happen. I quit focusing on the handicap and began appreciating the gift. It was a case of Christ's strength moving in on my weakness. Now, I take limitations in stride and with good cheer. These limitations that cut me down to size, abuse, accidents, opposition, bad breaks, I just let Christ take over. And so the weaker I get, the stronger I become. Weaknesses, Paul says, are good. In fact, in his weaknesses, he boasts. He even goes as far to add that a thorn or a handicap in his side, his persecutions and his hardships are actually not a bad thing. It doesn't make sense to us in today's world, does it? I mean, we live in a world today where we like to look good and we don't focus much on our imperfection. Well, when we do focus on our imperfection, it's how we can fix it to look good. It goes against every grain of this 21st century culture, doesn't it? Which tells us, conceal our weaknesses. Boast about what you're good at. Focus on your strengths. Discover your strengths. Minimize your shortcomings. Don't admit when you don't have the answer. Just wing it and fake it till you make it. In this 21st century, Paul suggests that the way to a rich, full life is very different than what we seem to believe holds success for us. Instead, he suggests that the only way that we're going to find success in life is by admitting that we are weak and we are powerless. For it is in our weakness and our powerlessness that God grants us grace and God does God's best work. Paul, a man who indeed could have boasted about his education, his wealth, his ability, his businesses, came to realize it was his weakness that gave God what God needed to work grace into Paul's life. He names the limitation simply as a thorn in his side, or the translation we looked at today was handicapped. Just something in life that he had to learn to live with. Now, first, he asked God to take it away. 3 different times he asked God to take it away, and God doesn't do that. What's interesting to me is that Paul never names it. He never names it, but he says whatever it is, it brings him torment. Some believe it was a physical ailment, an eye problem or migraines or even epilepsy or a speech impediment. Easy for me to say, speech impediment. Others say it could have been an addiction. Others say it could have been a relationship he had with somebody that was so overwhelming that it impacted him in such negative ways. We don't know what it was. We just know that this handicap or this thorn was something that Paul had to admit he was powerless over. And what happened in admitting that powerlessness gave God a great opportunity in Paul's life. I have to believe that most of us in this theater here today have our own thorns, don't we? Most of us here have our own weaknesses that God can work through. If we have a willingness, as Paul suggests, to name and claim those things and to turn them over to God, I think many of us would experience these challenges or these thorns in a very different way. All we have to do is pause and to name them in some way or another. Everyone in this room has different situations and ailments and relationships and addictions that we could easily identify. Those ailments or circumstances that keep us from living a rich, full life. No, Paul said, take it away from me. I don't think it's wrong for you to ask God to take away your weakness or whatever challenge it is that you might have. But keep in mind that if that doesn't happen, God can still do some of God's best work. No matter what, we are not less than for being a broken people. No matter what, The truth about life is we figure out really who we are, not by having it all together, but by recognizing we don't have it all together. This month, we recognize that life involves flaws and limitations, past experience and current conditions that we cannot erase. We have to be willing to accept them into our lives and to accept the things that have happened we cannot change, but indeed to look for God's grace in the midst of it all. Perhaps the greatest thing that we can share with one another is that we are not all that. As we talked about in the weeks before, most everybody in this room has been touched by addiction in some way or another. If you are not someone who's struggling with addiction, perhaps the best thing that you can do is to show to those in your life who are struggling that you don't have it all together. And in not having it together, you have come to realize that God's grace is enough, and it's all you need. Paul says specifically that God's strength comes into its own in our weakness. Mike Foster is an author of a book called You Rise Glorious, a wild invitation to live a fierce, free, and unstoppable life in a world that tries to break you, shame you, and tell you you're not enough. I'll put it on the website. You don't have to write that all down. Mike Foster is also a professor, and he runs a non-for-profit called People of the Second Chance. His story is fascinating. When he was 17 years old, a friend invited him out for a weekend of water skiing. He soon discovered in front of all the girls at school that he wasn't a very good water skier. He was feeling pretty down and low about himself when his friend decided he had a good idea. He was going to let Mike go ahead and drive the boat. Mike did take the wheel of that boat, and in 3 seconds, his life changed forever. He hit a skier in the boat that he did not see. The skier was seriously injured in those 3 seconds. Those 3 seconds, the shame and the pain came to identify this young man, this 17-year-old's life, and it led him to a life of shame and addiction for a while. There was some way that he was living his pain and his suffering from this 1 3-second experience that it was defining him. And it wasn't until he admitted that he could do nothing about the past and he was powerless over the situation that he was able to overcome his addiction that he had picked up. He came to realize that his powerlessness, his vulnerability, and his story gave God an opportunity to bring grace and love into the world. And now, he has taken his life, his struggle, his shame, his addiction, this experience, and is transforming the lives of others with his second chance effort, with recognizing that all of God's people are second chance people. He throws parties for people who are in jail, and these people have never had anybody identify them as a person of value or worth, and he does just that. He takes time to make sure that second chancers know that God's grace can cover them. He doesn't claim that he knows exactly how it works, but he knows when we recognize in one another our flaws, somehow God's grace takes over. This month, we have recognized that life involves flaws and limitations, that our past experiences and our current situations are flawed. We have taken the time to realize that, in fact, we often can't do anything, most often, to erase those experiences. And on some level, we have to accept that we are powerless and believe that there is a God who can make us move from this feeling to another kind of feeling. That we come to believe that God's grace is enough, and it's all that we need. God's strength comes into being through our weakness. Do we know how? Not exactly. We just have to admit that we're powerless. As we continue through these next 2 Sundays, remembering we are better together than apart, it's important to recognize that we are all flawed, that we all have different life experiences that gives God's grace an opportunity to shine. We've had different people share their stories throughout this month, and today Jim Reiser couldn't be with us, but Jim Reiser sends a video where he tells his own story.
My name is Jim Reiser.